I'm Betty Kovacs, and I became interested in other cultures and other ways of looking at the world when I was very young, because as a young child, I was always feeling a sense of emptiness. Something was missing. And I heard two major stories growing up. One was the Christian story about Jesus and living an ethical, loving life, which I very much appreciated, and I gained a great deal from those images. But it wasn't enough because I was taught intellectually what the religion was about. And so I couldn't believe the story of Christianity. The other story was, of course, the science story, and that was, of course, the story which gave us our worldview, is that there's nothing but matter, we are a fluke of nature, there is no meaning and no purpose, and when you're dead, you're dead. That is the worst, most damaging worldview that any culture has come up with, but all of us in the West grew up with that, and if you were intelligent, we were told, you accepted that. But I didn't want to accept the science story, and I couldn't accept the religion story, so it really put me on a quest. And the only way to fulfill that quest at that time was to go to university. So I went there, and it did lead me into studying about traditions that did not have that worldview. I wanted to find a reality that I could experience, that I didn't have to believe. I did not want to believe. I couldn't believe. I wanted to know it, to experience it. And that was a lifelong quest. Because at the time, early on, even in the 60s, we didn't really know that we had a very deep and profound mystical tradition. And the study of mythology made me realize that from Judaism into Christianity, that our true stories were destroyed and inverted into something quite different. As a child, of course, I knew the story of the tree of life through the old Judaic tradition. And that is that there was a tree in the Garden of Eden that we should not eat from. It was a tree of good and evil. And God said, you cannot eat of that tree. And of course, when God left for a few minutes, Adam and Eve naturally ate from that tree. So God knew it and told them they had sinned against the divine. They were expelled from the garden so that they could not eat of the other tree, which was the tree of life. And an angel was placed at the entrance with a sword so that Adam and Eve would never be able to enter the garden of life again. They were not worthy. This is the story of how we are flawed. We need to be saved or fixed. We are not adequate beings, not worthy really of life. But then as a mythologist, I found the original story in Sumer, before Judaism, 2,500 years BCE, there are incredible pictures, seals of trees. And one, which I have in my book, is the tree of life with the fruit hanging heavy from the tree. And the goddess on one side with the snake rising behind her, which was, I discovered later, a symbol of the rising Kundalini energy in each of us. That energy that's at the base of the spine that can rise all the way through the spine and the chakra system and blossom out in full light at the crown chakra. And on the other side was the male god. So we have the tree filled with fruit, the goddess and the god, and they are both offering the fruit. Their hands are out of eat it. Take it, for anyone who was ready to take of that fruit. And that was symbolic of enlightenment, of experiencing the divine within. There are many, many levels of consciousness that we can experience. It was never forbidden. And through the research of Old Testament scholar Margaret Barker, we now know that First Temple Judaism was a shaman mystic tradition. And the feminine was very powerful with the masculine. Both were present. And later Judaism, that's only Yahweh, only the male. But we now know that earlier that Yahweh and wisdom, that is the feminine dimension of the divine, were married. They had the sacred marriage, and together they created the world. Because what is the feminine symbolic of? She is symbolic of the right brain and the heart connection, and the land, nature, the cosmos. And the male was symbolic of all of the characteristics that we have of the left brain, the intellectual, analyzing, looking at something thoroughly. And that's a wonderful aspect that we have within us, but it is deadly, very destructive, if it does not marry the right brain that has a poetic logic. And then that, we know our ancestors made very clear, then all of that energy must flow through the heart, because the heart connects us to the heart of the cosmos, to the universe. So that was what the first temple tradition knew. Yahweh was married to wisdom, and together they created the world. Well, at 621 BCE, the Deuteronomist appears, and they completely destroyed that tradition. They got rid of the feminine. Yahweh had no spouse, co-creator. She was gone, and they burned down her groves of trees or destroyed them in other ways. Many, many images of the divine feminine, they were destroyed. So what we have after that is the male God makes the world, and he forgets all about his spouse. And without her, he suffers tremendously because he's a jealous God, vengeful, violent. And this is an excellent picture of what happens to a culture when they separate the left brain from the right brain and the heart, which is the organ of soul that opens us to this higher consciousness. We say the divine spark, or that we have it in us. Today, I think we're realizing that we are that everything is divine. So in shamanism, which developed 40,000 years BCE all around the world, it was a time in which the human being was realizing that we have all of these other aspects of the mind, and that they learned how to ignite the higher consciousness. Now, some of them did it through repetitive ritualistic movements, and we now know that actually many of the rituals that our ancestors did very, very early on repeated a rhythm that caused us to sort of release the restrictions on consciousness and experience a higher consciousness. So they developed techniques of experiencing higher consciousness, of sort of, well, I like the way that some people explain the mind is that we are all born out of universal consciousness. Every single one of us. That's who we are. We are the light. We are it. But we have a valve, a limiting valve, that reduces that consciousness to what we need for everyday life, like doing what you and I are doing now, or cooking, or going to the store, whatever. Every civilization, however, must learn how to release that valve so that we know and experience who we are, that we are this vast consciousness, that we are born into it, we are that, and it is our responsibility to learn how to release the valve so that we have those experiences and let that inform the way we live everyday life. Throughout the ancient world, there were mystery schools. And the mystery school was structured in a way that everyone experienced that eternal life energy that we were born out of. And they never doubted it after that because they had experienced it. So the mystery schools were all over the ancient world. There were many levels of mysteries experienced. Some focused on just knowing. Number one, the most important thing we need to know is that there is no death, that we are all eternal. And then there were other things that we could learn about ourselves and the cosmos. It was the heart and soul of Greek culture, because when we go there, we know there is no death. And the ancient world knew how to create sacred space, water, stone, electromagnetic frequencies, alignment with certain star systems, or the alignment with the earth energies. So when the human body enters the pyramids or any sacred temple, let's say in Egypt, you're entering into an alembic, you might say, in which you can be transformed. And all of those particular elements are constructed consciously to elicit certain forms of illumination in the individual. In other words, every structure was a manifestation of the principles of creation and structured in such a way that our energy field could be ignited and we would know. It's the mystic, the Gnostic state. So Egypt, we know now, had that, but the temples around the world did. When I was growing up, I thought there were only a few megalithic structures, but now we know they're all around the world. There's one that's just been found in Indonesia, Gunung Padang, Mountain of Enlightenment. Of course, there's Göbekli Tepe now, too, found in Turkey. Keith Critchlaw has written beautifully about this megalithic cultures, that they were both temples and observatories. What is very important to realize is that earlier cultures did not separate the mystic experience from the scientific understanding of it. There was no separation. And they were very good in geometry. And they built these structures where people worshiped. They also could experience the rhythms of the cosmos. It's so important, the geometrical structure and their alignments, of course, with the earth energies and the cosmic energies. The human being is a mediator between the energies of the earth and the rhythms of the cosmos. And these sacred places and observatories helped us to live in harmony with those rhythms and open us to that consciousness. So we have more to learn about the megalithic cultures. I think it's so important to know that there was quite a heritage that existed before Egypt. In fact, so many people say Egypt did not begin there. It's almost as what we see as a heritage, that what was earlier was more beautifully done than later. And just such a scholar existed in Europe, and that was Schwader de Lubitz. Of course, the Egyptologists would have nothing to do with him because he saw things that they did not. He studied every field of knowledge in Egypt, and it was very advanced. And he said that they had actually developed a sacred science. Or did they come in with it? Were they from the remains of a culture that had been destroyed? Because at Edfu in Egypt, in that temple, there are carvings on the wall, text, telling about the fact that the Egyptians did come from an island that had been destroyed, and that they brought the information with them that allowed them to create that old civilization of Egypt. And so they had developed the sacred science. They knew the principles, that is, the laws of creation, but that they didn't teach those laws. Those were kept secret. But in everything they did was a manifestation of those laws. In other words, he said, the complex of temples in Egypt, each one is a chapter in that science. And it's constructed in such a way that when you walk into it, you understand that chapter through immediate illumination, through an experience of knowing. And so if one were to be in all of those temples, we would have the sacred science through a mystical illumination. So Egypt is an incredible civilization. But once again, we didn't know that for a long time because the Egyptologists actually ended up saying that Egypt was really barbarians. They really didn't develop spirituality, which was as far from the truth as anyone could possibly get. They just couldn't see, which is a problem with the left brain. It's so important for us to know when we sever the left brain from the heart and the right brain, we can't see the context. We cannot see meaning. We can't see purpose. And we do not have the loving, ethical principles of the heart. So what we've been looking at all this time is the left brain, its limited description of what it can conceptually see. And it's pretty limited. And that's the dreadful worldview that we have. But now we know it isn't true, because with quantum physics, we know that there are multidimensional worlds. And we will talk about the Renaissance periods in Europe and when those master builders seem to have returned. The ancient traditions initiated the great builders to build the great cathedrals. Those too were built in a similar way as an alembic for our transformation. So there were 5 periods of an awakening of this underground tradition. And the underground tradition consisted of the ancient Egyptian death and rebirth mysteries, Hermeticism, and alchemy, and the Jewish Kabbalah, and the pre-Socratic philosophers, which came before Plato. They were mystics too. Parmenides is Pythagoras. Pythagoras had studied in Egypt. So what Peter Kingsley reveals, of course, is that wonderful knowledge about the pre-Socratics, but he also shows what we didn't know is that all the way from Spain into northern Africa, all the way through the Mediterranean, into Turkey, and Mongolia, Tibet, into the center of Asia, there was a shamanic tradition, a shaman mystic tradition. And he could tell that through the similarities of their poetic works and other aspects. We didn't know that. What is so important is for us to know finally that the Western world was rooted in a shaman mystic, and in the case with Egypt, scientific, and with the pre-Socratics, they were also scientific. So these are the roots of Western consciousness, deeply, deeply rooted in knowing how to trigger that valve to experience higher consciousness and knowing how to have a balanced life, a deep spiritual experience of it. But we know from the Judaic culture, First Temple, that it was suppressed and repressed by the Deuteronomists. And the Second Temple would have nothing to do with that tradition. But there were mystics. They knew that was nonsense. And so they formed groups themselves. For instance, the Essenes were known as a group that knew how to do that. They knew how to release that valve. Many ways of experiencing the sacred in themselves and in the land, in the universe. And so probably Jesus was born in the Essenes. He could very well have been part of one of these organizations, which were very much alive at that time. As Margaret Barker says, it was a renaissance of the First Temple tradition. Jesus was a mystic, a shaman mystic. But the church, however, inverted that. And they said, no, Jesus is God, and that you must worship him and follow him. So again, it takes it outside of us so that we can't experience anything. We have to believe it. So that was, again, a false myth. And I've thought for many years it didn't really matter whether Jesus actually was historical or not. Someone had that consciousness. Could be any one of the Essenes or Therapeutae. But I think there's more and more evidence now that Jesus was historical and that he was married to Mary Magdalena. But once again, the church got rid of her, and she was made to be a whore so that there could be no feminine here. But we can see that the masculine symbolizes the left brain, and the right symbolizes the feminine, with the connection to higher brain centers in the heart. And always there must be the sacred marriage of the two for our wholeness. So when we see religions with just one of them, then we know that something's wrong. Because we all know that the church canon, the Bible, was a selection of texts that were used in early Christianity. They were selection by the church. And of course, they left out things, they added things, and they completely refused to have texts that revealed Jesus to be a mystic. We did not even know that until after World War II. The Nag Hammadi texts were found in Upper Egypt because the monks who were there in early Christianity, they were told that they either had to destroy those texts or the church would come back and destroy them for the monks. So the monks dutifully did not destroy them, but buried them. And it is in those texts that we see a very different Jesus. And Jesus says, I did not come to save you. I came to remind you of who you are. And that, of course, would have been what we would have known had we been able to eat of the tree of life. That is, be initiated into that vastness of who we are. That's been wiped out. So Jesus, though, had said at the time, if you bring forth what is within you, what is within you will save you. But if you do not bring forth what is within you, what is within you will destroy you. And that's so beautiful because it's a mystic telling us we all have everything within us that we need to experience who we are. And he said, I am not your master. When you drink from my lips, you and I are one. And the other quotation, which is so important, is that it is not enough to follow the Christ. You must become the Christ to achieve Christ or cosmic consciousness. That's what he wanted us to remember, because the myths had been inverted, destroyed. We were lied to for centuries about who we are. No wonder we have the feeling we're nothing. So once the church took over, you could not even have books that had anything to do with such a tradition. Those traditions were forbidden, temples were destroyed, and anyone who even could utter something other than what the church said could be destroyed. It was a violent suppressive culture for 700 years. And it wasn't until about 1000 that everything that had been suppressed by the church just broke loose and blossomed in Europe. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, says that every change like that begins with a dream. And it did. I think that within us, there were the dreams, the visions of something more, the looking for something more. And so from about 1000 to 1300, there was an incredible blossoming of mystics, the Cistercian monks and nuns, the Beguine women who were independent women. Many of them were mystics. And there was the building of cathedrals. There were 80 cathedrals built in just France alone, and many big churches and abbeys. Something was going on. Just a huge blossoming of something that had been suppressed for 700 years. The woman was, everything was about the woman. Even chess, the game of chess, changed. All of the cathedrals were built to her because that's what was missing in culture. It's an interesting thing to see how we go unconscious, and then when it comes back, it's full force of exactly what was missing. It's just amazing. The mind seeks its own wholeness again and again. And so it was just an incredible time. And of course, here were the Grail stories that were so famous. They just were on fire throughout Europe. And the Grail, of course, the container, the feminine, the divine within us and the land, and she's always connected to the land because the land is part of our body, and they understood that. So King Arthur's court all struck out on a journey into the woods to find the Grail, the Holy Grail. But they also were learning how to be loyal to each other, how to be the best masculine that they could be and loyal to that, and then to honor and love and desire the feminine. That's so much said in ancient Egyptian mythology, is that the feminine must be desired and loved in order to know how to create in the world. But the church didn't quite realize what was going on, because in these cathedrals, there were many of the cathedrals that had this ancient labyrinth built right into them. And that was a journey to the center, which is a journey to the enlightened self. It is an alembic for our illumination and transformation if we know how to use it. And in Chartres, you're exactly, when you look up, the rose window with Mary holding the child, which is Christ consciousness, they're exactly aligned. And so we're told that Jesus taught a hidden tradition. Of course he did. And we find that in the Nag Hammadi text. And that actually, it was as though that just blossomed in Chartres around 1000. It just as though like a phoenix that developed so beautifully. All of these underground traditions emerged. And there's certainly stories about the Sufis working on the cathedrals and the stained glass, about the Kabbalists, the Jews, and the mystical Christians, that they were all working together on these cathedrals to bring back this knowledge of who we are. And when the church began during the High Middle Ages to realize that something is going on, then they put a stop to it the best way they could. But this was also at the time when they started the Crusades and they killed the Cathars. They massacred them, burned them, because the Cathar church was a church that was not like the Roman church. It was a church of the heart and of experiencing these things. But also then later, the Knights Templar, there were just so much destruction by the church. But in each of these periods, these ancient shaman mystic traditions, they've continued underground. The Egyptian death and rebirth mysteries and alchemy, they fused with the Judaic Kabbalistic experience, which is mystical. And later they would fuse, when the church kept going after them, they had to go into the Middle East. They went to Persia. They fused with the Sufi mystic tradition. That went back to Europe during the High Middle Ages because of the Crusades. So what we have is these underground traditions of the Egyptians and the Jews and mystic Christians. They were all being pursued by the church because they were talking about mysticism. And for the church, the heretic was the mystic. So anybody who was a mystic had to be very careful. But this teaching, this knowledge was still alive. It was kept alive. And the same kind of awakening emerged in Italy around 1460, but it emerged in many fields, as well as the spiritual, the economic, and it was just a more pervasive changing of the daily life. And artists were commissioned by people who weren't a part of the church so that they could paint nature and the feminine body and the masculine body. All of these things were possible, but it began with the discovery of the Hermetic texts. And those texts really are based on the Egyptian death and rebirth mysteries. Direct inner experience. Now these texts were brought back to Italy. And one thing that I like always to think about, a symbol of this, is that in the High Middle Ages, there were many paintings done of the Annunciation. This theme continued into the Italian Renaissance. The literal story is that the angel appears to tell Mary that she has conceived a child who is divine. But when you look at all of those paintings, you begin to see there's the literal story of the birth of Jesus, if you can call that literal, and there is the symbolic story is that here was a time when we had contact with a consciousness of another dimension, a higher consciousness, and that we were giving birth to a higher consciousness, the Christ child. That is actually what the symbolism of Chartres is about. It is about achieving higher consciousness. In fact, at Chartres, it is called the Mary, M-A-R-Y, mysteries, to achieve higher consciousness, which is symbolized in the Christ child. Not someone out there who's going to save it. We give birth to that child. And I think that that theme is carried from the High Middle Ages into the Italian Renaissance. So the underground traditions were alive and well in Italy. And a wonderful symbol of what happened, I think, can be seen in Pico della Mirandola. Here's this young man, brilliant, and he was very interested in the underground traditions, especially the Jewish Kabbalah, because he saw, he thought that's the same as Christianity, mystic Christianity. So what he wanted to do is to bring together all of the different leaders of spiritual traditions in Europe, bring them together and have them talk about this. He wrote what is called the 900 Theses. He understood that at the heart, all spiritual traditions, of course, are the same. And so he went to Rome to get them published. But the Pope caught on to what he was after. He was going to have the conference, can you imagine, in Rome. But when the Pope found out, He said, no, you will not print these, nor will you have a conference here. As a matter of fact, he put him in jail. And this censorship with Pico, it shows what happens to the young men and women who see, who know, and yet they're thwarted. And it's so clear that our evolution in the West was thwarted by this pervasive and continuous censorship. At any rate, though, it was not for nothing, because what he did write about Kabbalah and Christianity was picked up by other people outside of that particular period, and it made its way into England. And so England was going through, later than the Italian, its own Renaissance, and then with Queen Elizabeth, an intensification of that Renaissance. So they really did take in that underground tradition of Kabbalah and Christian Kabbalah, which was called Rosicrucianism. So the third Renaissance period in Europe is the rise of Rosicrucianism, these underground traditions. And by 1600s, many of these underground traditions met in Prague. This was a really grand meeting of the underground traditions in old Bohemia and Prague under Rudolf. And they worked together, and they were going to have a rebirth for the whole world. That really flowered in Prague, and it's called Rosicrucianism. But they too were destroyed in 1620. The church found out. They destroyed everything, even the texts. I mean, what they could find was absolutely destroyed. And after that, with 30 years of war between Protestants and Catholics, both were repressive, but the Protestants allowed a little more freedom. And so in 1660, some of the scientists who were in Prague were part of the Royal Society for the Advancement of Science. But the church censored the mystic. There could only be the study of matter. And that's why we have a left-brain worldview, because again, the censorship. And then in France were the French philosophers. This is the so-called French Enlightenment, because what we have in France is we don't need anything else. We have reached the apex of conceptual rational thinking. That's all we need is that. All those other forms we don't need anymore. They're for nothing, nonsense. Now we have the left brain only, and that is what has given us this tragic, limited consciousness. And what goes along with this left brain is a manipulative aspect. It's a limited view of what it sees. It sees only the parts, no meaning, no purpose. And there's a tendency to want to control. That's part of it. If it's split off, it wants power, it wants to control. And it also creates the fiction of its own superiority. In the 1700s, one of the first theorists who talked about this conceptually was Giambattista Vico in Italy. He knew very well that for the mind, he says, to experience its own wholeness, there must be an integral and dynamic continuum of movement between these two great hemispheres. And now we know what our ancestors knew, is that the heart is a brain component. It is our way to higher consciousness. Heart math has done so much scientific research to show exactly how intelligence is improved by letting that energy flow through the heart, and compassion and love. But our tradition was destroyed, so we didn't get the correct messages. It was destroyed by those who wanted power over us, and we're still suffering from that. We need the left brain debate, but only if it's constantly in touch with its context that only the right brain can give. And that is split off. And that's why it can be used to destroy the world. Because if we don't bring forth what is within us, we want power over it. And that is the present dilemma. Here are all of these people to whom has been given a toxic myth of insignificance. Nothing, no meaning, no purpose. And so they've constructed a world in which they'll control. And human life is not very important. And so after the Rosicrucian Enlightenment in Prague, and all the way from London to Prague, it went underground for a long time, and then it re-emerged in Germany around the time of Goethe, the German poet Goethe, late 1700s into about 1840. because Germany was the great resistance to the French philosophers and the new science that turned to say, look, wholeness is what it's all about. That was the Fourth Renaissance, and Goethe became an alchemist. He was taught by a pietist who really had been in touch with that underground tradition of the Rosicrucians that happened in Prague. So it's interesting how this tradition of discovering who we really are continued to live in the old traditions and then in the underground tradition. What is so important is to realize that this tradition is so powerful that in spite of being forced underground again and again, with a great deal of violence usually, it still exists. And the last time that it emerged is now. It's back. And I think that's why we see so many scholars independently have discovered these traditions. And we now are aware this was very powerful around the world. We had a mystical scientific tradition, and of course we want to regain that today. And so there's this new renaissance with the development of quantum physics, the discovery of these ancient shaman mystic cultures, and then with heart math, understanding the heart as a fifth brain component. We've just really discovering so many things. So this is the fifth Renaissance, and I think that perhaps this time we will make it. It is a heart consciousness that is who we really are, and that heart connects us with the cosmos. Many scientists who are connected will say they saw in a vision something that they brought forth scientifically, many of them. So we have to remember that there are many scientists today who are connected to the right brain and the heart, but they are very, very good scientists. But there are those who are so split off. That is a result of not connecting to the heart. We see that throughout our culture, the things we say, how could someone do that? Or people say, oh, well, that's human nature. No, it is not human nature. It is the nature of the left brain when it is severed from its own wholeness. And so that is the real challenge for us. We are at a crossroads, because if we cannot come to terms with our condition, there will be those who've received this toxic myth, who will want to merge us with the machine, and we will have no humanity left. I think it's wonderful to use AI and whatever to the advantage of life, but not for the replacement of it. And that is what we're facing. So that's why I think it's so important to know our history. I never knew that there was this depth of mystical tradition as the very roots of the world, you might say. That has been censored and lost, and we don't know who we are. People who have died, you might say, and experienced themselves in that other dimension realize that there is no death, that we are it. As Ellen Watts used to say, we are it. That life is eternal. We are born and die into the physical, but that we continue. And these people who have died and have had that experience have given so much to this present Renaissance in showing that life is eternal. They realize so many things. They have that consciousness so beyond what they had in time and space, but when they come back, they're usually so different that they want to do everything they can to create meaning in this particular dimension. So many people have had these near-death experiences, and they see what our particular worldview didn't allow them to see, and they know it because they've had the experience, and so they come back and they're living life in a different way. And I think that our science today is discovering that and helping us to realize that we are cosmic consciousness and how to regain that experience and how then to use it to create worlds that are not so destructive as this one. Here these people have died and they're having an experience, and they've come back to tell us that. We in the West need that convincing that there is life after death and there is something to experience. And isn't it interesting that it comes right now? This is a time of the discovery of this consciousness that we are when we most need it, because so many people have been wounded and think there's nothing, absolutely nothing. So our time with this powerful renaissance of the 20th century, 21st, is a realization that we are cosmic beings. We have that consciousness. How do we access it? And how do we behave in the world? How do we help to heal ourselves and others before we destroy ourselves and the planet? And so I think it's interesting that just as all of this past is emerging archaeologically and texts are emerging that we didn't know anything about, that finally we break the slavery to a science that is only materialistic. And now quantum mechanics has just shot through that out into the universe. And people who had experienced mystical consciousness were saying was very similar to what these scientists were saying once they discovered the quantum field. They were saying that here is an eternal realm of beingness out of which everything comes and everything returns. It is eternal. It records everything that is ever said, ever written. Here it is. So the quantum physicists were discovering a field, the quantum field, that the mystics had called many different things, but it was the mystical field of consciousness that the mystic experienced. So they realized that they were experiencing the same field. Finally, that our scientists were able, through the study of quantum physics, to know that there is a quantum field. And everything that we do is recorded, and it's eternal. And that's what the mystic had always known about the spirit field. Everything is recorded. Everything is alive. So it was a kind of coming together of science and mysticism, which had existed in the underground tradition and the earlier cultures, is that there was no division between science and mysticism. Just the inner experience was just understood by the left brain. And so it was all one. It's so important that we know our history. This history of a cosmic consciousness and how to participate in a larger consciousness was suppressed and repressed. People were killed by even suggesting that it existed. And so we have to realize that it is possible, so how do we do it? I think we're learning. We're going to use the old methods. We're going to create new methods. Quantum physics is helping us find it, near-death experiences. And certainly I talk about this in my book, the crop circles. People have had experiences in the crop circles. With UFOs, there have been vast experiences of consciousness. And I think we have to cull out the things that aren't true from the things that are true. Carl Jung was such a good guide in looking at the symbolic language in our dreams. What are the dreams telling us? As he would say, these ancient myths, these stories about who we really are not made up by the left brain. They are developed by an organizing principle of the soul. And if we look at these stories, we can see they are reflecting back to us the principles of the soul. And we are studying that. I taught mythology for years. That was the classes I loved most. Fairy tales. Fairy tales are very symbolic. And if we learn this symbolic language, we begin to learn how to understand our own experiences. I had a dream when I was teaching that I had gone to a foreign country whose language I didn't know, but I had gone to teach them their native language. And I think that that is true. We are learning our native language, symbolic language. It has its own logic. It's a symbolic logic, a poetic logic. But when I was growing up, a dream was just something you ate too much and, whatever. It had no meaning, no purpose, whatever. Sometimes it does seem we're just doodling, but then there are dreams in which you know that there is an organizing principle and it is giving us information. So we're learning how to do it. I think that many people are having experiences and developing methods. We are highly creative beings. We simply have to get in touch with that essence of who we are. I had spent my life searching for this, trying to understand. And I went to the university. So, of course, there was simply the left brain was emphasized. And I taught mythology, that attempt to, has been said, mythology is everybody else's religion, But it is symbolic. It's of the right brain and the heart, and it has structures about who we are and how we can become. And in all of those great mythologies, there is the knowledge that we have a great consciousness that we can experience. That's who we are. And so I just was on a quest for years, and that's why I went to South America to work with shamans. So I'd studied everything I knew to study, went here, went there, but it wasn't until the death of our son that there were spontaneous visions that came. And my husband was not interested in any of that. He was a businessman, and he honored my interest in it. I was always trying to study to find this or that. But before our son died, he had, in his office here in this house, he had a vision of his car on the side of the freeway with our son Pishti's body superimposed on it. And he knew he was dead because it was two different dimensions. And he said himself, "It's almost time for you to do this." And that shocked him because he didn't know what he was talking about. And then in the vision, Pishti said to him, "That's right, Dad. It's almost time for me to do this." And a little bit later, then we got the call that he had been in a car accident. And after his death, my husband had so many experiences. And I did too. And so much of it had to do with why we were born now and why this is such an important time to be alive, is that we are at the crossroads of either perhaps becoming a machine or opening to the cosmic consciousness that we are. But I had to deal with my university-trained rejection, of these experiences, even though I'd longed for them all my life. So first of all, Pishti wanted us to know that he was very much alive and still creating. And we had long periods of conversations with him. We actually recorded them, so when I wrote the book, I kept very close to what we had actually experienced. Because I had not been sure, in spite of all of the study I'd done in the mystery schools and everything else, I didn't know. Intellectually, I thought probably, but I had not experienced it. And he wanted us, of course, to know that death is simply transition. But he also wanted us to know that the earth is going through a powerful transformation, that this is a very critical time, and that we were going to go through a very powerful period of transition. So he talked a lot about that. And we had many experiences. I had an experience even before the deaths, and I think this one is a very important one because it's for the entire planet. I was with two other people, and I had an experience that it was just one of the major experiences of my life. The other two didn't see what I saw, but they knew something was happening. They felt it. And that was that there was a very sacred and powerful disc of light that came into the room through the glass doors, came in and hovered over me. And the energy was so powerful I could hardly bear it, but it pulled me up, and out of it, there was swirled out of the bottom of this disc a feminine being with a square satin hat and satin dress to her waist, I could see. So here's the disc is circular, the hat is square. It's a mandala, a symbol of wholeness. And she went into my heart and she began to sing. She sang, "We are here to be with you all three. You have called us and we are here." Then after that, there was this deep knowing that there was a field of light around the planet, that they were the consciousness that we had drawn to ourselves around the planet, but that they could not connect to the planet until there was a degree of consciousness achieved on the planet that asked for that help. The others didn't see that, but they felt it. They knew it was there. And it was kind of an interesting kind of thing because it was during that ritual that we went through the experience of connecting to the planet. Now, after that, I read of Sri Aurobindo in his ashram in India, that the mystics there had experienced that, I think, in the 50s. And exactly as I had explained it, they had experienced this flooding in of this cosmic consciousness. And now we had reached such a critical point that there was enough longing and seeking this light that it could connect to the planet. And it was as though there were anchors in the planet, and they actually connected that light, which would flow into the planet. It was in my life, when I had many experiences after our son died, I did not have anything that was that powerful, knowing that this cosmic loving energy had been called and it connected. And that it was because we now were ready for it. So that gave me a lot of hope that in spite of everything that we are confronting today, given our history, that the energy of the planet seeks this larger consciousness, this heart consciousness, and that we are connected and that we can heal ourselves as we go through this transition of integrating the right brain and the heart, which connects to the heart of the cosmos. And so the earth is going through a transformation process. It looks bad right now, but there's another story that's being played out. And I think this is very hopeful. And if I hadn't experienced it, maybe it'd be hard for me to believe it, but I know it because I did experience it. Then another vision that's so important to this whole process, although my husband and I had many, and it was such a shock that my husband would have them. In fact, he became my anchor because he just had not been interested in that before. But he had an experience, and after the experience, he said to me, "Do you have the I Ching?" Well, he knew I had had it. We hadn't used it much. This is the Chinese Book of Changes that really is quite a mystical, scientific book, if you could call it that. And I thought, well, what is he talking about? So I ran to get the I Ching, took it back into the bedroom. So he said, look up the hexagram that goes from the top to the bottom. It's usually from the bottom to the top. From the top to the bottom, straight, broken, broken, straight, straight, broken. Oh, I thought, what is going on here? Anyway, I found it. And it was the hexagram, work on what has decayed. And I said, well, how could you remember the hexagram? And he said, well, that's easy. If you stand it upright, he said, straight is a straight line, then broken, broken, straight. That's M is straight, broken, broken, straight. And then L is L, and it's slanted. The last line is slanted. So he said, it's merchants of light. Well, here's my husband who'd never been interested in these things, talking about these mystical things and merchants of light. And he said, not only that, it's miracle of life, miracle of love. And that very clearly that it's an energy field that's come from above down through, just as I had experienced in this other mystical experience. And it changed the whole energy field. They taught him so many things about what we're going through, and me too. After that, we became they were teaching us. And so work on decay was the name of the hexagram, working on what is decayed, that we had through all of these suppression and repression of who we really are, of our wholeness, that obviously our consciousness had decayed. You cannot live just left brain without becoming violent, as we have. But we had enough connections, obviously, that we wanted that full connection. And I think that those who lost the connection entirely are part of who we are. We want all of this light to heal all of us, the whole human species. But it was that once we separate that, then the decay sets in. And we've affected the whole planet now. So work on what has decayed was for the whole world, is to try to bring all of this together into wholeness once again. These were experiences that continued on many other levels and totally changed his life and changed mine. I had hope because I knew that we had called. In fact, that voice that day said, "You have called to yourselves this day." All those on your planet have called to want healing, to want wholeness again. And we have called that energy, which they said had been around the planet for a very long time. Now they could connect to that energy and anchor it in the earth. Each one of us becomes an anchor in it when we experience it and know that that's what's going on. So that was very helpful, because I was, for a long, long time, I just had not had the inner experiences that could make me know rather than believe a thing. I couldn't believe it. I had to know it, and finally I did. So I have hope for the healing of our planet, that we can learn again to use the whole mind that it will be synchronized, the whole mind working together. It's a beautiful mind. If the right gives information to the left and it works on it in its way, goes it back to the right and goes through the heart, connecting to the cosmos, we will finally begin to understand who we really are. Cosmic beings with cosmic consciousness. But we must learn how to achieve the activation of that within us and on our planet. When did this all start? I had said that shamanism did develop all around the world. And it's interesting that in the West, in Europe, that's when we have the first evidence of culture, you might say. And we see that in the cave cultures from 40,000 BCE. The paintings in these caves are absolutely exquisite. It's very clear, I think, if one goes there and has had any contact with shamanism, you sense that these were for rituals of experiencing other states of consciousness. But that is not what the archaeologists thought. And finally, there was a scholar from South Africa, David Lewis Williams, archaeologist who'd worked with the San people, so he knew shamanism very well. And he could see the connections. So he, with the Frenchman Jean-Claude, published the book on shamanism in the cave cultures. And first, of course, the scholars wouldn't go along with him. They're usually the last to accept changes. But finally, that is pretty much accepted today, that these were cultures that were mystical cultures, shamanistic cultures. People were initiated into this higher consciousness, into contact with that realm beyond the stone. And their pictures actually drew those entities through the stone into the world of time and space. And after the cave cultures, or during the time of the cave cultures, the San Bushmen were also great mystics. They lived in the Kalahari Desert for centuries, obviously, completely in tune with nature, it seems, because they're in nature. They live by nature. And the West didn't know much about them for years because they'd look down on them. They are what some people call a murdered culture because they were attacked from all sides. But they were in tune with cosmic consciousness. And when they were out hunting, and someone back at the home camp for the time being would want to get in touch with them, they would feel this fluttering in the heart, and they would get the message that was being sent. I think that people like this teach us that there's so many possibilities and potentials that we haven't developed. But they did develop it because they needed it. And they had what they called the small dance, a small treasure, and the dance for the great treasure. The small was simply being able to live from day to day and have enough to eat and be safe. But the dance of the great life was precisely experiencing that larger consciousness that we are. And interestingly, they could actually, that energy, they could form into like little needles and actually throw it at someone and ignite that consciousness in them. This is a very strange thing that we knew nothing about. And Bradford Keeney experienced them in a dream. He knew nothing about these people, but he was a pianist and he was playing the piano one day and he had a profound mystical experience. He didn't know what to do with it because he'd never heard of such a thing. He didn't know what had happened to him. So he kept it to himself. He went to MIT and then he was offered a job in South Africa. And just before, about 2 weeks before he went, he had a dream vision in which he was actually shown a map of where to go and meet the people who lived there. And he did, and he got guides to take him there. And of course, it was to visit the San in the Kalahari. When he was crossing the desert, he saw a group of people running toward him. And they said to him, "We are so happy to see you. We have been waiting for you for so long." And so he was really one who had such respect for them, and he was with them over a long period of time, on and off, and he learned their methods of achieving cosmic consciousness and has written about it. And also, they trusted him enough, after knowing him all these years, they allowed him to write down their mystical spiritual teachings, and so he has published that. And there's a story that I want to tell that comes from these people that's so touching, because this story kind of expresses what's going on. The story is that there was a man who had beautiful cattle, but a couple of mornings he got up and there was no milk. And he couldn't figure out why in the world there was no milk. So he stayed awake one night to wait, and he saw coming down from the sky people, these beautiful women, and they came in and they were laughing and having a great time. And he chased them, but he couldn't catch them except one. He married her. They lived together for a long time, but she gave him a box, and she said, "This is very, very important, but you must promise me that you will never open it." And so he didn't. And years went by, and then one day she was out in the fields, and he saw the box, and he thought, well, why don't I open it? What was that all about anyway? So he opened it, and he started to laugh. And when she came in, she looked at him, and she knew immediately that he'd opened it. And he said, "You silly woman, there was nothing in that box. Absolutely nothing. Why are you keeping an empty box around?" And she just put her hand over her heart, and she said, "Nothing? You saw nothing?" And he said, "Of course not. There's nothing in that box." And the story is that she turned away and walked away, and she was never seen on the earth again. But the old woman who told the story said it wasn't so much that he opened it and looked into it. It was the fact that he saw nothing. And so this is the story that is told, because it explains why they will not tell. They have not told their stories to anyone, to the white man, we might say, those outside of their culture, because they know they can't see it, they can't hear it, they can't understand what they're talking about. So it was kind of, we were in that position, the white culture, I think, for so long, is that we looked at them, we saw them as inferior. What did they have to teach us? Nothing. And yet they have this incredible ability to achieve cosmic consciousness. And they develop methods of dancing and with bells and jingles and sounds and repetitiveness, and sometimes days, nights. And they would go into an altered state of consciousness. And the majority of the men and women were shamans in the San tradition. They were a beautiful people, and they still exist in Botswana and Namibia, small groups though, because their culture's practically destroyed. But they had the ability to live life with such laughter and humor and joy that they really are an image for us to think about in the West. They knew the land, nature so well that they could live in it and experience communication among themselves wherever they were, and also with the animals. The animals are just incredible, how the relationships they have with them. So I mentioned them because of their ability to achieve cosmic consciousness in a very joyful and full way. All over the world, from about 40,000 to the present time, many indigenous cultures still do this. One of the major ways of opening, releasing that valve is through sacred plants, sacred medicine. And it's so interesting in South America how they knew exactly how, for instance, with ayahuasca, to prepare it and which two plants they needed to add to it. I mean, they knew how to do this. And when the West found out about these plants in the 60s, the West knew nothing much about how to go about things. And of course, I was teaching during that time. People used the plants in ways that were not always beneficial to them. But that's when the word broke that there was a way to release that valve through sacred medicine. I think that was a question with the discovery of LSD in the culture. This was a sacred medicine which had been used very carefully in spiritual traditions that opened that valve and allowed us to experience the cosmos. So here we never had that. We just kind of went crazy. Of course, I was teaching during that time with LSD was emerging, and students were experiencing all kinds of things, and it was dangerous in a lot of ways because students didn't know. Many people didn't know quite how to do it and overdid it and so on. But it was like just simply that bursting forth of this longing to know more. So that LSD was one way that they did that. And it was both dangerous and absolutely changed the course of our history to a great degree, because finally people were experiencing it. But I had a man whose son died because of LSD. I mean, he was at Berkeley, he was on the roof and he stepped off the roof. So there's a lot of tragedy associated with it, but we did not have those structures in our culture that knew how to open up larger dimensions of consciousness, how to release that valve in a way that was safe and that could be used creatively. So I think that that's what we've been trying to learn. And then, of course, in our culture, there was a terrible thing against any kind of plant or elements that would do that, would release consciousness, because they were afraid of it and we needed caution. Many young people were hurt tremendously by it and didn't know how to integrate it. And I think that the indigenous people know how to use these things and integrate them for the development of our own soul well-being as well as the culture. And so that's what I think we're learning better now. And many indigenous people still do use the plants in their area for that. And they are open to the ethical, loving principles of the heart. There is no higher consciousness without love, without the heart.